Hello, I'm David Sykes from PMA Consulting. I'm joined by my colleague Casey Quinn to share our thoughts on HTA and market access learnings from the recent experience of anti-PD-1s. Thanks very much for people in attendance. This is the first in our spring webinar series. The second webinar, Clarity or Confusion, the Role of Value Frameworks in Oncology, will be broadcast on Wednesday, March the 9th. Followed by the final webinar of the spring series, Does 1 + 1 always equal 2? Valuing combinations. And that will be broadcast on Wednesday, March the 23rd. If you have not already done so, please visit the PMA Consulting website to sign up. I will begin the session with a quick review of the key emerging trends in oncology market access, as well as an overview of the current and emerging landscape for melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer. I'll then hand over to Casey, who will take us through recent decisions for nivolumab and pembrolizumab in Germany, France, UK, Canada, and Australia. And we'll carry on to outline key learnings for manufacturers who are developing anti-PD-1s or who will be competing in the same patient populations. Before we start the content, just some housekeeping. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions, so please type in your questions in the lower box on the dash panel as illustrated on this slide. We will aim to answer all questions, but if time does not permit us to answer the questions, we will follow back up with those individuals after the webinar. Please note that questions will only be visible to the PMA team. So firstly, I'm going to talk a bit about the key emerging trends in oncology market access. And this slide here highlights those key trends. And as everybody on the call knows, market access is becoming more challenging across pretty much every country and every payer archetype. I won't go into detail onto the key concepts and issues here, except to say we will be touching pretty much all of these throughout the webinar today. So the starting point is the regulatory approval of the anti-PD-1s. So Opdivo, nivolumab, and Keytruda, pembrolizumab are currently the only anti-PD-1s approved. Pembrolizumab was the first anti-PD-1 approved by the FDA in September 2014 for second-line melanoma. And in the US, Merck has also received approval in first-line melanoma, second-line PD-L1 positive non-small cell lung cancer. In the EU, EMA has approved pembrolizumab for unresectable or metastatic melanoma. BMS quickly followed on the initial Pembro indication, has received indications in melanoma as monotherapy and in combination with ipilimumab, as well as second-line squamous non-small cell and broader non-small cell indication as well as second-line advanced RCC. And in the EU, indications exist for melanoma and second-line squamous non-small cell. So this landscape's moved very quickly. As you can see from this slide, there's a lot of indications likely to hit over the next 2 or 3 years. And that's based on a lot of data showing that anti-PD-L1 is active across a wide range of tumor types. And again, this slide highlights the potential registration indications for anti-PD-1s over the next 2 to 3 years. BMS and Merck have the lead with their established indications and also testing across a lot of these indications outlined here. And other manufacturers, including Roche, AZ, and the Merck Group, are developing their own anti-PD-1s, either on their own or in partnership with other companies. And in total, there are over 12 anti-PD-1s in the clinic today. Anti-PD-1s are being tested in combination with existing chemotherapy in combination with targeted agents and also in combination with other IO agents. So there will be an explosion of indications sought over the next 36 months. As well as different indications, Roche and AZ, the Merck Group have major programs in non-small cell cancer and will launch into an extremely competitive landscape. And this is an important point from a melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer perspective, because this shapes the market access challenges faced by new entrants. So you can see from this slide here the clinical context into which these anti-PD-1s have launched and into which new anti-PD-1s will also launch. So from having nothing in melanoma for about 30 years, in 2011, ipilimumab was first approved, and now we've seen multiple effective options stratified according to BRAF status, line of therapy, and prior therapy, and the landscape is now moving towards combinations of BRAF and MEK inhibitors, as well as ipilimumab and nivolumab. And this rapid development of the access landscape has also been a huge learning curve for both manufacturers as well as payers as well. And we'll argue later that even in indications that are not as competitive as non-small cell lung cancer and melanoma, pretty much all of this learning curve will be carried over to future payer assessments. And this clinical context, which provides the framing for HTA and access discussions, focuses on the whole of the treatment landscape and not just the anti-PD-1s. So it's not just the anti-PD-1s that will be reviewed in isolation, it's in the context of the clinical landscape. I think what we've seen with melanoma is that the payer bar has been raised with this experience and this rapidly evolving landscape, and that's going to be carried over to other indications, and I think the next playground for that is non-small cell lung cancer. Again, we've seen a competitive landscape stratified by clear biomarkers with agents indicated specifically for treating genomic tumor aberrations, and we'll see a number of new agents coming to the market over the next 2 or 3 years, and all those learnings from melanoma will be transplanted over to lung cancer. So the way we're going to critically evaluate the existing anti-PD-1 HTA and PNR decisions is through this framework here, and we'll come back to this at the end as we identify potential insights and learnings for manufacturers. And you can just see, moving from 12 o'clock on the clock face, a number of these agents have different value propositions, both within the same tumor but across tumors as well. Some of those might be an OS story, some of those might be an improvement in AE profile story. So it's going to be an important thing for manufacturers to consider as they're developing potentially competing and contrasting value propositions. The role of the biomarker is uncertain, and we'll explore that in a bit more and explore how that's been viewed by payers so far. The immaturity of survival and extrapolation through comparators, ITC, treatment sequencing and pathways will all form major segments of the discussion that my colleague Casey is going to take us through in a minute. But the important thing to remember, of course, is payers are set up to try and dilute value propositions and evidence such that when they come to pricing negotiations, they're in as strong a hand as possible. So that's the underlying theme behind all of this. I'm going to hand over to Casey Quinn now, who's going to take us through some of the early learnings from agencies from France, Germany, UK, Australia and Canada. Thanks, Casey.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So David said I'm about to run through the HTA and reimbursement and access learnings, and I'm taking 2 directions for this. First, as you can see from this slide, I'll be looking at what we can learn from HTAs and reimbursement that we can learn country by country. And then after this, I'm going to talk about what we can learn that can be learned by thinking about the anti-PD-1s experience within the context of oncology and immuno-oncology. So the country context is important because what we can infer from the experience of the existing assessments and how we can extrapolate from those is inevitably tied into context. And as what David had just illustrated a few slides ago, there's actually quite a lot of non-PD-1 activity in these countries in terms of in melanoma and NSCLC, drugs that have been introduced, drugs that have been reimbursed. They haven't all been assessed the same or in the same order. And what this is going to mean is that the natural history of disease is going to vary by standard of care. That's going to affect prognosis. It's absolutely going to affect incremental cost effectiveness and economic value more generally. It also means that the presence of other biomarkers in these agencies can lead to segmentation and sequencing, but in some agencies or indications, but not in others. So it can vary, and I'm going to come back to that in a little while because it's quite interesting. And then, of course, each agency's experience during previous assessments can set a strong precedent. And then finally, there's what I would call agency-level heterogeneity. You know, different agencies qualify as different types of payer archetypes, and within that framework, they tend to focus on different aspects of assessment. Some will be particularly focused on access schemes or discounts. Some will focus a lot on comparators, standard of care, and subgroups, and others will try to focus on budget impact or restrictions of the eligible patient population. If we start on our whistle-stop tour with the UK or England and NICE specifically, in NICE, pembrolizumab for melanoma has been assessed first, followed by nivolumab, and then off into the future pembrolizumab again, but in NSCLC. It has a long experience. For those who are familiar with melanoma, NICE was the first agency typically to assess melanoma products as far back as the arrival of ipilimumab. That has given this agency in particular quite a long set of preceding cases for assessment, and it's meant that the evidence review group has also been quite activist when it comes to assessments for melanoma. And the pembrolizumab assessments definitely saw that. There was quite a lot of criticism coming from the review group around the immaturity of the data, around the extrapolation of the survival benefit, not just for OS, but for PFS. And it led to quite a lot more attempts than usual by the ERG to conduct exploratory scenario analyses of Merck's work. So we saw quite a lot of variation in the outputs in the ICEs. And we have seen that again for nivolumab. In both cases, they qualified for end-of-life criteria that helped, but we also saw some consideration and uncertainty around long-term benefit relative to short-term benefit and around the duration of treatment. And in fact, in the nivolumab FAD that came out, the appraisal committee also recommended a review of this again in 2 years with the idea that there'd be more data available. So reducing some of that uncertainty, ideally with a combination of pure clinical data, but also field work and real world evidence. And then in the case of nivolumab, off to the side there with NSCLC, the final appraisal is not yet out. The consultation document is, with an interim recommendation not to reimburse nivolumab, and the focus there was also around the extrapolation of survival, with some more attention being given to the indirect treatment comparison and meta-analyses and the heterogeneity of the trial data that was available for use. If you look at Germany, by contrast, nivolumab was assessed first. So here we have a different sequence of events in this country. And what we also see in Germany, because it is an agency that focuses more on subgroups and comparators, there's a lot more BRAF segmentation in the German market and in the assessment by IQWiG and the GBR. And that shook out a lot, as you can see, for nivolumab and pembrolizumab in melanoma around the comparisons and around the assessment of additional benefit. You can see that they're dictated by BRAF status and by the subsequently considered appropriate comparator. One thing that you do note, though, is that like NICE in the GBR assessment, there wasn't a particular focus on PD-1 expression as a subgroup. And I'm going to come back to that because, like I said earlier, it's quite interesting, particularly in melanoma, where we see BRAF as a preceding biomarker, if you like. In France, only nivolumab's been assessed so far, even though both had ATUs and pembrolizumab had an ATU first. And ATUs are quite interesting in France, and they can be critical components for market access generally because they're temporary authorization for use in advance of marketing authorization. And this is something that's going to show up for Australia as well, which has been quite interesting. They're typically tied to unmet need as a matter of policy, but they're quite useful for building real-world evidence that is France-specific prior to formal assessment. And that can be very useful for a lot of manufacturers. What we also saw in France was very BRAF-orientated reimbursement of products, and that can affect the comparison in terms of what a given drug was compared against, and it also affects the subsequent assessments. One thing that's interesting to note, as you can see, the Transparency Committee, unlike the others, actually accepted the methods of extrapolation of PFS and OS data, although they were more in favor of the earlier lines, and they weren't convinced that sufficient data existed to confirm benefit in second-line therapy after ipilimumab, for nivolumab specifically. For the Canadian context, similar to England and NICE, pembrolizumab has been assessed and came first. Nivolumab's final assessment is in development and hasn't yet come out. Also, much like NICE in Canada, PERC were quite critical of the immature PFS and OS data for both nivolumab from what we've seen and for pembrolizumab. So in the Canadian context, we're seeing the same criticism being applied to both submissions, which is a PD-1 specific issue that we'll pick up on in a moment. And like the Transparency Committee in France, they also didn't like the data that was presented for nivolumab in second line after prior therapy with ipilimumab. And they didn't like that as much of the rest of the data package. It was sort of structured much the same way as the French assessment was. So that was clearly a weaker part of the data package. Also, like NICE in the Canadian assessments, CADTH made a fairly clear call in their publication for pembrolizumab for more data generally, and they specifically asked that there is more evidence-based guidelines produced and made available to help steer sequencing and to help steer pathway decisions, which is increasingly becoming an issue not just for payers, but down to clinicians as well when it comes to what to prescribe and in what sequence for patients. Now, Australia is quite interesting, and full disclosure, I'm from Australia. You should visit if you can. But it's actually interesting in this context because it has had the most assessments of products, as you can see from the diagram along the top. It's assessed both pembrolizumab and nivolumab. And the nivolumab assessments in particular have been an example of something that's called the extreme parallel process. So a parallel process is essentially parallel assessment at a regulatory and a reimbursement level. The extreme parallel process, in inverted commas, is when PBAC assesses a product before the TGA has granted marketing authorization. And in this instance, that took place before TGA documentation even existed, which is not an especially common thing to occur, but it does exist, and it could be something that occurs again in the future. And what that will do is limit at the point of reimbursement some of the contextualizing information that might otherwise be found in regulatory documentation. That can affect the evidence package. That could also affect HTA and reimbursement tactics from the perspective of a manufacturer. The other critical thing that we should observe is pembrolizumab wasn't recommended in the first instance. Sorry. The thing to observe is that pembrolizumab wasn't recommended that much earlier in the year than nivolumab. The sequencing between them, the timeline was not that great, but it was sufficient time that when nivolumab was assessed the first time, it wasn't accepted because its comparator was ipilimumab. And at that point, PBAC already declared that pembrolizumab, not ipilimumab, should be the required comparator. And that work had to be redone. And you can see along the top that it was subsequently assessed against pembrolizumab. That was okay. This also isn't a particularly common occurrence for PBAC or generally, but even as a weak precedent, it's absolutely something that people should make note of. You know, given the rate of clinical development in PD-1s, in all of the indications that David went through, there's no reason why a precedent like this wouldn't take hold and wouldn't be particularly attractive to payers. You know, it is a good mechanism by which payers can argue that the demonstrated value of a new product actually isn't that high because it's already compared against outdated standards of care. And I think that in particular is something that manufacturers probably should tune into indication by indication. So that was the whistle-stop tour through the countries and what can be learned and how they shook out differently. The other approach that I mentioned wanting to take was, what can we learn about the HTA and reimbursement experience of anti-PD-1s by thinking about them as PD-1s specifically and what attributes of their experience relate to that specifically, and what attributes actually relate more to immuno-oncology, which is a broader phenomenon, of which anti-PD-1s and PD-L1s are obviously a very, very important part. But the reason why I think this distinction is important is because, you know, if you're a manufacturer who is developing an anti-PD-1 or an anti-PD-L1, the critical issues for you to consider that are very specific to PD-1 or PD-L1 expression or how it functions as a biomarker, there's going to be quite a lot of very detailed work required for that. However, if you're a manufacturer who's, say, not developing an anti-PD-1 or PD-L1, or if you are launching with such a product but you're not making it a key part of your value story, that doesn't mean that the learnings that we're discussing don't apply, because a lot of those learnings do still apply to immuno-oncology and contextual factors, and they are still germane to the HTA challenges that manufacturers are going to face. So there's value in thinking about the two of them separately, but we should all absolutely tune into both of them. One shouldn't precede or displace the other. So what I will do is, if we return to the diagram that David had put up earlier with some of the key learnings just laid out in this framework, we can distill from the HTAs that have existed over the previous slides that we looked at into these general buckets. You know, starting at the top, one thing to consider is variation in the value proposition. So for a given anti-PD-1 or PD-L1, the value proposition, the value that you can demonstrate, will vary across tumors. And as a given product is brought to assessment across tumors, there's multiple opportunities for payers to negotiate on price. And when they negotiate on price, of course, for a given submission or indication, that affects the price across all indications. How PD-1s and PD-L1s function as biomarkers is going to be something that has to be thought about. We saw this a little bit with melanoma and NSCLC, and this isn't grammatically correct, but if we think about the PD-1-ness of your biomarker, some of these issues arise because of the PD-1-ness or the PD-L1-ness of the product. You know, what is the PD-1 or PD-L1 expression like? It varies tumor by tumor. What is the impact or the link between that level of expression on prognosis or treatment effect? That is going to vary tumor by tumor. In some instances, there will be pronounced benefit from exploiting this, and in some instances, there won't be. But also, how this works can be dictated by, in the case of melanoma, we saw the BRAFness of the tumor. That had a much more important effect on segmentation. In NSCLC, the EGFR-ness or the ALK-ness was a factor, not such a strong one. And as you look out across all of those indications that David illustrated, where we see a lot of anti-PD-1s and anti-PD-L1s being developed, this is what we need to think about. In a given indication, if a PD-1, PD-L1 based product is the first with a biomarker, how that works for assessment is going to be quite different from an indication where there's already a biomarker in place. So gastric, for example, there will already be HER2-ness of gastric cancer, to some extent MET-ness, although that's less so since the failure of a MET-based product. But it's still the case that a PD-1 or PD-L1 based drug that is first with a biomarker, that will be a very different value story. It'll be a very different set of modeling challenges. In terms of the immaturity of survival and extrapolation, I mentioned that across a bunch of countries, it is one of the pan-country or pan-agency issues that is germane to immuno-oncology generally. As we see more development, as we see more breakthrough, more fast track, more accelerated approval, more and more we're seeing drugs going to market, reaching HTA and reimbursement with immature survival benefit. Reimbursement HTA agencies still focus on this. They still dial into this on a methodological basis. In amongst this, PD-1 and PD-L1 expression still functions as a biomarker, as a potential mechanism in regression-based extrapolation of survival data. And the question then is, how well does this function as an indicator of prognosis, of natural history and survival, and of treatment effect? And how well does that function within the context of other factors? You know, if we look at melanoma again, there's been a lot of this in assessments. PD-1 as an indicator of long-term survival or treatment effect isn't that well established relative to a lot of other factors that have shown up in assessments. And this is the same thing. Indication by indication, as you look at your launch sequencing, manufacturers need to think about what that context is going to look like, because it won't necessarily be something that's transferable from melanoma to bladder, for example. It just won't work the same way. And this is also true for comparators and ITC, and it's also tied to the relatively rapid clinical development. And in fact, those three going around the left-hand side, ITC, network meta-analysis, what is the appropriate comparator, how do combinations fit in, how do we conceive of treatment sequencing and pathways, are all effectively outcomes of this same phenomenon, which is relatively rapid clinical development of anti-PD-1s, anti-PD-L1s, relatively rapid clinical development in the same disease areas of other products, which will have an impact. And then combined with that, increasingly the use of anti-PD-1s in combination with other drugs. And obviously that has an impact on everything from the shape of survival, response rates, long-term outcomes, definitely the cost base, but it also affects what the comparators look like, how ITC might work. It affects survival modeling because of subsequent therapy and bias. And of course, country by country, we're hearing more and more from primary research that we undertake that there's more and more of a need for some sort of pathway or sequencing, something that's evidence-based, something that can guide everyone from clinicians up to payers about what the appropriate sequence is of treatments once they're reimbursed and in what patient population. So there's a big segmentation question there as well. What I'll do now is wrap up a little bit before we take some questions. In terms of wrapping up, there are two things to talk about. What's on the current slide is essentially what can be distilled from what we've just talked about, what is directly inferenceable if you like, from the existing HTAs. What I want to talk about next is what we can infer from that, looking forward and looking outwards. What other issues we can reasonably safely predict will occur. So as we run through this list, I think David mentioned this earlier as well, melanoma is a portent of things to come. I mean, in and of itself, it is a freestanding, very interesting case study for one indication with multiple new products coming reasonably rapidly, different mechanisms of action, focusing on different lines of therapy. What we've observed has been a steep learning curve both for payers and for manufacturers. But what we take from that is that the learnings from a payer perspective in terms of the risks and the uncertainty and the sources of uncertainty and what those mean, what the methodological challenges are, what things they will severely criticize, what things they just won't like a little bit. All of these have been reasonably thoroughly internalized, and we should all expect, country by country, that these are now the starting point for an assessment in oncology, and even more so with rapidly evolving landscapes. So there's this set of learnings from melanoma around methodology that we think are going to apply again and again and again. Definitely on oncology, definitely with the arrival of more and more products quickly, and definitely as there's more of a challenge to demonstrate value. In terms of the technological and the methodological challenges, these are still ongoing. We can see this in melanoma, we can see this in lung cancer. There's been no resolution to any of these issues that I've got listed here. Methods for ITC and network meta-analysis continue to be challenging, continue to be a source of criticism. Adjusting for differences between trials or patient characteristics in an attempt to make indirect comparisons in a meaningful way hasn't been resolved. It continues to be an issue. And then finally, and most importantly, the extrapolation of OS into long-term benefits has yet to be done in a manner that an HTA agency has actually accepted without quite a lot of criticism. And if you look at pembrolizumab and nivolumab, we're actually adding PFS extrapolation onto the same set of challenges. So if anything, this is getting worse. And if you think about the rapid development and entry into the market of new drugs, the impact in terms of bias of subsequent therapies is only going to get worse. And what we take from this as well is that in the absence of trial data, looking at the clinical trials that are currently running and how those comparisons work, more so than usual and increasingly there's real value in real-world evidence. HTA agencies have said this themselves, as well as being able to support basket trials for anti-PD-1s, which are in existence and quite useful in their own right. Real-world evidence can also complement trial data by helping to demonstrate treatment patterns, relative use of comparators country by country, and getting some good information on natural history and background mortality, which is getting increasingly uncertain. And finally, like I said, there is a list of things that we can infer from all of this data, even though they're not necessarily apparent in the data. For example, if we run through them, treatment sequencing and place in therapy, I would consider critical success factors now in order to know. Your guidelines can't keep up with the arrival of new drugs. So as a manufacturer, even outside the realm of reimbursement, how do you influence local access? How do you influence uptake of your product in the face of clinical uncertainty around pathways and sequencing? There's a lot that can be done there. There are pricing implications to this around two fronts. If you have a given anti-PD-1 therapy and you're looking at multiple indications, if you have multiple treatments arriving for a given indication, and then finally in the face of this, payers conducting group assessments and reassessments, from a manufacturing perspective, it's important to bear in mind that all of these represent repeat opportunities for payers to negotiate and renegotiate on prices. Every time one of these arises, there is the potential for the price of your product in particular to be weakened. And of course, if your price of a product in a particular indication is weakened, it's weakened across multiple indications. And part of why that's quite interesting to think about is because it starts to set up the question of what's the added value to a manufacturer of a new indication or of multiple indications, particularly if this is going to mean adding reduced quality evidence and more exposure to price, volume, or risk sharing into that context. This is going to be a more important thing to think about in the future. The second set is where we start to see the idea of access in inverted commas becoming a broader concept than what we're typically used to within a more narrow HTA or reimbursement framework. And it should now include thinking about patient segmentation and sequencing. It should include thinking about the current state of outcomes data, for what agencies in what indication is overall survival a necessity to have demonstrated clinical benefit, and where is it not? And how might that affect your launch sequence? How might that affect your evidence generation? And the access opportunities for bundling indications versus separating indications, which is tied back to that first point about the added value of a new indication. How do we think about that strategically? How do we think about that tactically for a specific product? And then finally, with the clinical development increasingly including combinations, which isn't something that's really appeared yet at a formal HTA level, but we know that payers are focusing on this, they're keeping an eye out for this, they know that it's coming down the pike, payers know that combinations represent a significant budget impact. Combinations become a critical area of focus for payers, they have to become a critical area of focus for manufacturers. To be aware that payers will be seeking to contain costs as much as possible. In order to do that, they will be leveraging everything that they've learned about anti-PD-1s in immuno-oncology and how uncertainty is present and what that means for clinical benefit or cost effectiveness. They'll be seeking to manage budget impacts. They'll be seeking to push more risk-sharing agreements, and so understanding how those work are another critical success factor. And then finally, related to this, from a manufacturer's perspective, again, developing evidence and developing strategy for post-reimbursement market uptake is something that we should start thinking about as being more and more important for market access in inverted commas. So being able to provide more information more broadly out to clinicians and patients around safety, around the relevance of, say, rapidly progressing disease, if it's something that's biomarker specific, and around how strong the biomarker is in indicating the potential for a patient to benefit. All of these things are important channels of communication to maximize uptake. So that is the extent of my run of the HTA and reimbursement learnings. Like I said at the start, we think that there are two channels for this. One is thinking about them on a country or agency basis, and we saw the variation in that and how important it is to understand the local context for an indication and its history and the local context for a given anti-PD-1. And then the second set is how important it is to be aware of a given challenge. Is that challenge related to the PD-1-ness of the problem, or is that challenge related to immuno-oncology as a broader challenge, and how does your anti-PD-1 product fit into that? And now I'll pass you back to David.
Thanks, Casey. I'll let you just take some water. Perhaps I'll take the first couple of questions. The first one is a reasonably straightforward one. Will each new indication result in a price renegotiation? I think Casey's touched on that at a couple of different points. For countries where there are price volume negotiations or renegotiations, such as France, Italy, Spain, etc., it's almost certain that there will be a new price negotiation every time. For countries like the UK that look at these indications in isolation, that may be less of an issue. The second question relates to the concept of reassessment. So HCV has triggered a new focus on reassessments across many countries. given the rapidity of changes in that market access environment. And Casey, the question is, how can we as manufacturers prepare for these reassessments?
The short answer, I think, would be carefully. They're certainly very likely. I mean, they exist elsewhere. Again, melanoma is a good example. NSCLC is probably a very good example, where you have enough products coming that any given payer should inevitably realize they've got parallel tracks of previous assessments, established value for money, negotiated prices and price discounts. It just makes total sense to conduct a reassessment and take the opportunity to update methodologically what you learned and what you said about, 2 products 3 years ago based upon everything you've learned since, and a product that you assessed 1 year ago, stack them all against one another. And I think that will inevitably lead to more HTA challenges and price negotiations.
Thanks, Casey. The next question is around survival extrapolation. Is obviously key to driving value perspectives. There are challenges around patient identification and patient heterogeneity. So who are those responders in the tail? And the question is, are there different approaches for general oncology versus IO in terms of survival extrapolation?
I think it's more that the approaches relate to IO specifically, and they will bleed out into general oncology, which is a poor choice of words. And anti-PD-1s fit into this because PD-1, PD-L1 expression is one of the options. And the thing to consider with this is, certainly this is one of the learnings out of melanoma, the payer perspective on extrapolation isn't so much how do we quantify that flatter tail. It is understanding there is uncertainty in that flatter tail. And this ties into the manufacturer's value stories all the way along as well. We always want to see the argument that some patients will respond to immuno-oncology, be that an anti-PD-1 or not, and those who do respond can achieve de facto cure. And then the payer perspective is, okay, that's reasonably uncertain. If you can help me predict which patients those are, we can start to differentiate the value proposition. And so what you're seeing in the methods of analysis are tied towards the heretofore unobservable heterogeneity in survival. How do we make that observable? PD-1 expression is one of those, but it's not the only factor.
Okay, great. Two questions left in the time, Casey. Quick response to this. Rapidly evolving landscape presents challenges from an ITC NMA perspective. How do manufacturers anticipate and prepare for this?
I would say the two biggest. The first is to establish a very, very clear understanding of what came before. So if yours is the 4th product in the last few years, tune into what happened to the first 3 and how the trend of the assessment evolved. Develop a firm understanding of what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. And then the second is confront that head on. Understand what is actually technically feasible. What's the best job that you can actually do? And then map that to the payer expectations. And on that basis, I think work out your tactics. Not all agencies are actually worth approaching with what they will consider to be unacceptable NMA methods. And in understanding that can save a lot of time and improve access opportunities.
Yeah, okay. And then there are a number of questions we've not been able to address, so apologies, but I'm going to take one last one. Given the multitude of indications for an anti-PD-1 asset, what do you consider to be driving the pricing discussions for subsequent indications? And I think in answer to that, it's a combination of obviously the starting prices of earlier launches, but it's also the actual net prices that countries are paying for these assets at the time of evaluation. And obviously, the longer the lead time from your launch relative to the Nivo and Pembo price and all the potential renegotiations that happen within a tumor and across a tumor, each each new indication is a bite of the apple for the payer to go and renegotiate price. So we'll be very careful about thinking about where those actual prices could end up, because I think they will move down very quickly over the next 2 or 3 years with a multitude of different indications. Casey, any more thoughts on that?
No, I agree with that. I mean, manufacturers should basically expect that payers are very happy about multiple products showing up for an already costly indication, because that gives them the opportunity to bring those costs down. They look forward to that.
Great. Thank you, Casey. So apologies to all the people we didn't get round to in terms of the questions. We will get back to you all individually after this. If people want to hear a recording, then please feel free to reach out to us. And we'd like to thank you for your attendance at this webinar. Thank you.